Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 840th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, the Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring David Byrne and Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky. We're thrilled to welcome poet Tyhe Cooper here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. David Byrne is a musician, performer, writer, and multidisciplinary artist whose creative ventures have captivated audiences since 1975 when he co-founded the musical group Talking Heads. Recent works include Theater of the Mind, an immersive journey co-created by Byrne and writer Mala Gaonkar, Social at the Park Avenue Armory, the Broadway production of David Byrne's American Utopia, as well as the Spike Lee directed film version, Reasons to be Cheerful, an online magazine, and the solo album American Utopia. To date, Byrne has published 5 books, including How Music Works. And our host today, composer, multimedia artist, and writer Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, immerses audiences in a blend of genres, global culture, and environmental and social issues. Miller has collaborated with an array of recording artists, including Metallica and Yoko Ono. His 2018 album, DJ Spooky Presents Phantom Dance Hall, debuted at number 3 on Billboard Reggae. He's an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Paul.
Hey, happy Monday. And I have to admit, David's been a kind of an inspiration for many years. So it's a real absolute treat to get him in the mix here with the Brooklyn Rail. So David, thank you for making the time.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Good to see you again. We've known each other for quite a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm all grown up a little bit here. So I got a couple things. I went to your opera yesterday, and I was really blown away by the dimensionality of it. So when we were just getting ready to talk, there was a kind of a little moment of history where I was fascinated with, on one hand, the opera deals with both revolution, politics, and above all, the way that the Marcos and Aquino and all these different kind of dynasties were sort of grappling with the legacy of democracy. So do you want to just kind of walk us through that a little bit, and then we can kind of go into different directions? Does that work for you?
Yeah. The show is, well, I describe it to people as an immersive disco karaoke musical. And yeah, so what that means is that about half the audience is on a dance floor, and that's where they watch the show on a dance floor, and most of the performers take place in the perimeter around them on platforms. You can see the platforms down at the lower level. There's one in the middle that kind of turns around and acts as like a runway and a crosswalk from one side to the other. And then there's other people up on these galleries. And this photo is taken from a kind of balcony mezzanine. So there's different ways you can see it. But for a lot of the audience, it's as if you're in the Philippines and you're watching this happen, and you're being seduced by the Marcoses and their populist politics. And that's my hope anyway, that the audience gets seduced the way the public is seduced by various politicians and policies and all sorts of things. And then at some point they see that it takes a dark turn, and it all goes wrong. And the audience, I hope, feels slightly betrayed. Like, what happened to that person that a minute ago I was supporting? Now they've shown their kind of true face in a certain way. And it ends with the revolution that the peaceful revolution that ousted the Marcoses in the mid 80s. And that's it briefly. The music is all kind of variations, mostly, not always, but mainly variations on dance music, because Imelda, the former First Lady, loved going to discos. She had a mirror ball installed in her New York townhouse. Not all of us have mirror balls installed in our houses. So that to me implied a real commitment to dance music. And I thought, maybe that's a metaphor. Maybe the dance club is a metaphor for what it feels like. That kind of escapism and kind of the ecstasy and headiness of being a person in power who came from nothing to be a person in power.
You know, what's fascinating about the way that the opera works is that you dimensionalize it and the singers are spread and dispersed throughout the room. So the audience is kind of in this sort of pointillistic situation where you have a voice coming over here, the light focuses, then some other voice moves over there, then people start dancing. And the fun part about that also is it's an electronic music situation. And I'd love to get you to riff on that a little bit, because you come out of the tradition of funk, world music, and you know, kind of looking at some of your collaborations over the years. My favorite all time is the one with Brian Eno, where, you know, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, a classic funk track, Regiment, is awesome. Do you guys, I mean, how do you feel about the notion of electronic music as a forum for this? Because there's always different ways that acoustic music and electronic music overlap. And I'd love to just hear some of your thoughts on that, because you have such a lineage with that.
Well, just in this show, we mix a lot of electronic beats and sounds with mostly pre-recorded sounds, but there's also, as we integrate them, there'll be some live musicians kind of coming in at certain points to kind of engage the audience some more. But a lot of the club music that they're dancing to is kind of electronically produced, but then augmented by other instruments and things like that. And I'd heard, this was many years ago, maybe it was in the late 80s or something, I'd seen interviews with DJs who played at, you know, did sets at these big clubs, and they always said, oh, there's an arc to the evening. I bring the audience up and then I drop it down. They kind of chill out a little bit, and then I bring them up again. And then it's kind of this roller coaster ride that the DJ describes as this is the kind of the arc of the evening. And I thought to myself, what if that arc actually was a narrative arc? If these stories, the music that they're playing actually told a story, and the audience could be dancing and having a great time while they're also kind of absorbing almost by osmosis this story. At least that's the way I originally conceived it. I originally imagined that it would not be in a theater, that it would be in a disco, but pretty much all the big discos are gone now.
You know, that's an amazing, I love the idea of the arc of the evening as a narrative kind of structure, because funny thing about beats is their pattern. And most DJs, like there's a collaboration, say for example, between you and Fatboy Slim. And Fatboy Slim, just for the audience, is considered to be a kind of the glue holding the electronics together, and David as the kind of conceptualist for the whole thing, just to make, is that a good way to sort of put that?
Sure, that's fine, yeah.
Okay. And you're coming out of a band kind of history, and being in a band is very different than being a DJ. You're like, oh, as you know, you being a DJ, you have to juggle all these different variables of sampling, collage, your archive, your record collection, and the Marcos stuff. It's kind of funny because the disco component, it seems to be like a lot of dictators like disco. Saddam Hussein also had a disco thing. Various dictators in Africa had crazy discos built into their palaces. You know, even just El Chapo recently, you know, they found that he had a crazy music room. And I've always wondered what your take on that would be, for how you would use that. And I love the way you said that the disco ball in the living room of the Marcos is in New York. But at the same time, having that as a departure point for theater is brilliant. Do you remember earlier we were talking about both Verdi and Wagner? And Wagner coined the term Gesamtkunstwerk, which in German just simply means total artwork. but he also really made it a point to have these kind of conceptual layers going on with politics and revolution and mythopoesis. How did you come to be interested in the Philippines? Because it's a kind of, for the American imagination, it's sort of over there, but there's actually a lot of Filipino DJs, by the way. Mixmaster Mike was for the Beastie Boys. DJ Q-Bert's a famous scratch DJ. And I've always been, they play your records, by the way. So,
That's nice to hear.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yes, why the Philippines?
Yeah.
I think, okay, so I had these kind of thoughts about telling a story in a dance club. And then I'm old enough to remember when Imelda Marcos was around, and she was kind of like a larger than life glamorous figure, wife of a dictator, who was always going to parties and hanging out with socialites, and then occasionally making some really kind of giving some memorable quotes. I used some of those quotes as lyrics in the songs. I mean, they were too good to just throw away. I couldn't write anything as good as her saying that I'm the people's star and slave. And I thought that encapsulates her attitude and kind of the relationship as she saw it right there. So I thought, let me do some research and see if there is a story here, because she seems like someone who belongs in this environment, but let's see if there's a story. So I started reading a lot and went to the Philippines twice, and it was, there definitely is a story. And the more I researched, the more nuanced it got. It wasn't as simple. It was never as, it got, I started off thinking of it as a very simple story of, like good and bad. And the more I researched, the more complicated it got. The more nobody was completely good or bad. Everybody had a kind of cynical side to them. Even this guy who plays Nino Aquino, who's basically our hero. He's not entirely clean either.
Yeah. And the Philippines is one of these kind of chaotic, but also very intriguing legacies of both colonialism, American imperialism, and above all, the Cold War, the non-aligned movement. I mean, it's kind of wild to see all that rolled up into one geographic kind of kaleidoscope. And the way your opera kind of deals with the legacy of its complexity, nothing like you were just saying. I mean, but the funny thing about dictatorships is they usually try and have a reductionist kind of model. Obviously, Putin being dictatorship 2.0 at this point, but the use of art, music, media to reinforce their power. I really enjoyed the way that you kind of played off of Imelda Marcos. She was a singer, and she. Do you want to tell how the plot of her meeting Marcos and like that, because that's part of the opera as well?
She was as a young girl. She was from the poor side of a very influential family on the island of Leyte, which is kind of south of Manila. Marcos is from the north, into the area called Ilocos. It's kind of more of a rough and ready kind of cowboy area. Her area is more tropical, but so she's quite beautiful and quite tall for a Filipina. And she meets him. I think that might be this song. She meets him and he sizes her up. She's kind of impressed by him. He's a senator at that point. And then he just disappears, and he sends her gifts every day for 11 days. And on the 11th day, he proposes and has a guy come with him with papers for her to sign. She's really impressed. This guy's a senator. She's really impressed. He's handsome. And yeah, they make a very glamorous picture. They were, on the cover of Time magazine, which was a big media thing back in the day. they were compared to the Kennedys. The U.S., as you said, has and still has a very special relationship with the Philippines. The U.S. has a huge Air Force base outside of Manila that they used as a staging area for bombing Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And so they had to have in order to maintain that base, they had to have a really tight relationship with whoever was in power in the Philippines. There were, all during that time and probably continuing, there were kind of leftist, sometimes communist uprisings in the hills in the Philippines. Sometimes these were really small, but politicians like Marcos could make use of that. They could easily just go to the US and say, hey, we got some communists here. We need a little help. We need some money to help keep these communists in line. And this is the Cold War era. So when the US held that, it was just like, oh, yeah, we're right behind you. We got your back.
And eerily enough, Duterte's daughter is the vice president and Marcos's son is now the president again. So these kind of loops and layers. At the end of the piece, the gentleman comes out and says, history is repeating. And it's having a sense of the legacy of U.S. for better or for worse. I mean, the Cold War, and then obviously you have Russia, China, communism, capitalism. The piece definitely kind of navigates between those points, and of course dictatorship. So I'd love to hear, because a lot of your work has been very lyrical over the years. I mean, I have a bunch of your albums. One of my favorites is your collaboration with Robert Rauschenberg, which was a limited edition print Rauschenberg did Responding to. By the way, anybody in the audience, I collect that one. I will never sell. It's like an absolute classic, David Byrne and Robert Rauschenberg. But you also work with Robert Wilson and Ryuichi Sakamoto, who was also a very dear friend and who recently passed away. How do you navigate between these kinds of distinct periods of creativity? Because you went from popular music, but you went to RISD, and then kind of navigated. Who would have guessed? I mean, you were an unpredictable band coming out of that. I started to go into the history, but it gives a nice sense of your current, vision, because you're dealing with neuroscience, you're dealing with music and creativity, design, theater. But how did that? Do you want to just dip to your childhood just for a second to kind of give the audience a little bit of perspective?
Okay.
RISD?
Yeah. I went to art school for RISD, and then the one in Baltimore, MICA, for a little while. I continued to make art and still do. And at one point when I first moved to New York, that was my ambition, to be an artist who showed in galleries and all that kind of thing. And but at the same time, for fun, my friends and I would play music, in Rhode Island, we had a band for a little while, and then we came to New York, and I continued to play music and occasionally write songs. And some of the other band members from Talking Heads said, well, why don't we make a band? Why don't we make a band? And look, there's this club around the corner, CBGB's, where they let anybody play. If you can play. I mean, you have to audition, but if you're good enough, they'll give you a set. So I did that, and it wasn't like overnight success, but it proved to be successful. And so all my energy went there. And then gradually during the MTV era, I realized that for a little bit of money, you could make a music video, and unless there was something horrible about it, they'd start airing it immediately. They were desperate for content, and they didn't pay for the content, not at first anyway. It was seen as promotion for your record or whatever. So they were just desperate to have anything. So I started working with people and directing music videos and that kind of. So that became my visual background. Started to feed back into what I was doing. I could kind of reincorporate that part of my interests through music videos, which was so that was a lot of fun. And then that eventually got me into seeing a lot of downtown theater, whether it was Mabou Mines or Worcester Group or Robert Wilson or different people. And to me, that was another kind of eye-opening experience. There was a very different way of looking at stage performance. And of course, I saw being a band as being a stage performer. I didn't know what we were going to do on stage. We mostly just stood and played, but I thought, wow, there's lots of ways to do this beyond what you normally see a band do. I wonder if there's other ways of thinking about what you do on stage besides, what all these bands have already done. So that kind of got me going there.
And it's incredible because you intersected with people like Brian Eno, who have been producing David Bowie. Brian Eno ended up producing a bunch of stuff with you. And Brian also has a deep legacy with music and art as well. And from my perspective as a record collector and somebody who's really into looking at the legacy of those records, the music videos are just brilliant. I have to admit, when I saw Once in a Lifetime, you like bow ties. They seem to kind of be a reframe, that comes back. I always wonder why David every once in a while you just have the bow tie thing, and of course the big suit, which was a kind of a classic. I always thought that was a riff on Elvis. Is that true?
No. It was.
Okay.
It came. The inspiration came more from traditional Japanese theater.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. That's a left field one. But okay,
Yeah.
so, but amusingly enough, the 70s and 80s, obviously that music was in a huge transition. You had Kraftwerk, Africa Bambaataa. You had the legacy of the 60s funk and soul music movement, Parliament Funkadelic, obviously Sly and the Family Stone, but then the punk scene. You guys you were able to kind of distill a lot of these different movements, even new wave. Some people used to say that Talking Heads was new wave, which I always felt you guys were a funk fusion meets art kind of thing. But fast forwarding now to the theater, and let's pivot just for a second and talk about your installation work with the neuroscientists. Do you want to riff on that for a second, because you've written books How Music Works, and then now we have an installation in Denver, Colorado, which is kind of going to a musician's mind and getting people to think about creativity. Can we riff on that for a second?
Sure. Over some recent years, there's been a lot of books about the brain and neuroscience and things like that. Kind of really fascinating stuff. The big takeaway from a lot of these is that we don't experience reality. We create it through our perceptions. Our kind of perceptual organs feed things into our brain, and our brain makes a show that it shows to us. Hence the title, Theater of the Mind, from this piece. That came from an Oliver Sacks quote. And so I saw these I read about these interesting experiments and perceptual things and all sorts of stuff that various labs were doing. And at first I thought, wouldn't it be great to experience some of this stuff instead of just reading about it? So first I approached a lab and said, can you recreate your experiment in an art gallery in New York? And anybody who comes in can be a subject. That never happened, but that got me started. So I started thinking, how could you present this stuff? And the more I thought about that there was more than just one isolated thing in an art gallery, but you could have a few of them. And then we started doing workshops where we had a few of them in different rooms that an audience would go through them, not on their own. They'd be led through by someone. And we thought, okay, we obviously need a story or some reason for you to go from room to room. You can't just wander. And these were things where you have to sit here, look at this, now do this, now do this. You can't just wander in and go ooh and ah. So we tried different kinds of stories to do this. One of the first ones we did was we came up with an imaginary neuroscience collective called the Institute, which and we said that the show was a presentation of the Institute as a way of furthering and kind of outreach, getting their work and the insights that they were discovering out to the general public. We had all this, we had the guides talking about the Institute and who started the Institute. We had like a vitrine display case with a Nobel Prize in it. You can buy a Nobel Prize online. They're fake, but they look just like a real one. And a surprising number of people completely bought into it. And but then we realized it's a great gag, but it doesn't really, it's not emotionally engaging. So we did more workshops and rewrote the script over and over again until it really had a real narrative that there's a reason why you're going through the rooms. And the reason is the guide is dead. And the guide is taking you back through moments in their life and looking at it, and you re-experience it. You as an audience member are friends of theirs from when they were alive. They know you, and you all have name tags. Every audience member has a name tag, so they call you by name and go, "Oh, do you remember when we did this? Do you remember we were like, I was 10 years old and we had a backyard birthday party?" And so it keeps going back further and further into the actors, the characters' past, and you start realizing that the perceptions are faulty and the memory is faulty too, and that different people, whether it's the guide's parents or their friends, had very, very different perceptions of what happened, perceptually and as far as their memories of the experience. And it culminates in a live virtual reality room where you're embodied in the body of a doll, of a small doll, which is supposed to be the actor, the lead character, as a small child. This is when you're how old are you here? Maybe around 6 or so. You're like 6 years old, and this is your family kitchen. So this is what it would look like to a 6-year-old.
Wow. So that reminds me of that infamous line from M. Night Shyamalan's movie, The Sixth Sense, where he said, the character at the end, it's revealed, he says, "I see dead people." And it's kind of, you realize the whole movie's been a flashback and all this kind of, it's very David Lynch update as well. I've seen photographs of the exhibition. Regretfully, I was in Colorado, but I was in Aspen, and it had been on my bucket list, but then the pandemic happened and I think it got moved. But it's now fully up and running in Denver now, right?
No, it ended in Denver back in February or March, and now we're talking about moving it to Dallas. We're hoping to have it in Dallas next year, and then some other cities after that. It's as you can tell, the sets are elaborate, so it's a lot of stuff to move.
Yeah, and so let's also just pivot for a second, because there's a degree of drawing and other things that you did with your Pace show as well that I think love, Here Lies Love, the theater of the mind, and then your drawing and kind of lyrics that I'm sure you saw the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. The directors, one of them quipped, I can't remember which interview, but he said, listening to your song once in a lifetime, like, you may find yourself here, you might wake up and this is not my house, this is not. And they were just saying that had been a smaller inspiration for the movie, because the characters keep moving through different dimensions in the multiverse. And the multiverse is actually this kind of infinite possibilities of their identity. Like the characters kind of, every couple minutes you realize they're in a different universe. But I always felt that your song Once in a Lifetime was an affirmation of this idea of infinite identities moving around. Like, where does that poetry come from for you? Like, because there's a lyricism both between Black preachers, like that's something that seems to be a refrain a lot. Like, in, for example, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, there's a radio recording of a preacher kind of giving a gospel thing. But whenever I hear you remind me of like a church vibe or something. Like you're kind of, does that ever, pop up?
Oh yeah, and like that song, I was listening to a lot of radio preachers, and so I heard it as this vocal, like a vocal performance. It's somewhere in between speaking and song. kind of a hip hop thing. It's somewhere in between just talking. It's not just talking. It's talking kind of brought up to a level where it becomes like an incantation, and it's right on the edge of singing. There's a lot of rhythmic phrasing, repetition, the kind of rhythmic emphasis in the way the words are put out, and a lot of preachers do that, politicians too. And so I thought, oh, can I kind of pretend to be one of those people, and let's see what comes out. So I just kind of got myself worked up and started stomping around the loft. I was in the Lower East Side at the time, and I'd blurt out some phrases and quickly write them down, and then keep going and write down some more, and quick down and write some more. And I wasn't paying attention to if they rhymed or anything like that. I just accumulated a lot of stuff, and then kind of took a deep breath and sat down and tried to edit it.
Wow, that just blew my mind, because well, it's a common theme that returns in a lot of your work, is that kind of, it's talking at someone plus kind of riffing. Like the other night, there was a big party for the estate of George Orwell. Long story. They had a whole bunch of different artists reading from 1984, George Orwell, and for the after party gala thing, I played Once in a Lifetime. And it's incredible. This happens almost every time. Like everybody remembers the choral riff, Once in a Lifetime, and everyone just starts singing the refrain. And but same thing happens with Here Lies Love. It's like you get that kind of nugget that it can be expanded into different singer-songwriter things. That as a DJ, that's what you play on a riff, and then you expand that riff, and that's what rocks the crowd. But when I was watching, I regret I missed American Utopia. But I saw elements of it online, and obviously there's the Spike Lee thing. Do you want to riff on that for a second? So why America and why Utopia? These are just kind of just putting it out there. What's on your mind with that?
Wow. Yes, I was in the middle of making the record that was called American Utopia, and went to see a Chance the Rapper show at Forest Hills, I think it was, the tennis stadium there. It was very uplifting, his show at the time. And my friend suggested, well, why don't you call your record American Utopia? And I thought, that's oh man, that's asking for it, right? People are going to say, what are you, super patriotic, or what's your attitude, or you're being hyper ironic here? And I thought, no, that's going to be the trick, to say, no, this is not ironic. We're going to show you what the possibilities are. We're going to show you that what's possible, which is maybe not as evident on the record, but in live performances, you see a really diverse band, and everything else is stripped away except just us and our instruments playing in an empty space. So it's all about this little community and what we can do together, how we can all work together and to do something that's really ecstatic for an audience. So I think in the end, when people saw this, they realized, no, the title is sincere. He's really sincere. He's really talking about what we can be. Yeah. Not necessarily what we are, but what we can be.
Okay, and so amusingly enough, you've always had a very warm-hearted and generous spirit towards other musicians. It's David. You can see David riding his bicycle around New York, and in a very friendly and congenial manner. Recently, I chuckled over this one because I was traveling and people lost their minds. You went to the Met Gala on your bicycle, and people went, "Wow!" That was like, it went viral. It was just this crazy moment. Do you want to riff about urban design and bicycling? Because I know you're very interested in bicycling, and you think of cities as places where, the bicycle and the idea of getting rid of cars. You've written extensively about bicycles and urban design. And you're interested in architecture as well. Do you want to riff on that for a second?
Yeah,
Bikes?
Sure. I mean, years ago, I lived on the Lower East Side, and it was a very different place. Taxis didn't come there very often. The subway was not that close. So a bicycle was a really good way of getting around. You could ride it to, if you want to go to art galleries in Soho, or if you want to go hear some music somewhere. That was a pretty efficient way to do it. And I kind of on and off stuck with it. And in more recent years, the city has put in a lot of bike lanes and little dividers and barriers and this and that and the other. And it's a huge change than what I was doing, which was kind of, I wouldn't recommend it to most people. It was kind of pretty risky because people didn't expect to see a bicycle on the streets of New York. Now it's really common. But that, of course, that got me interested in kind of urban infrastructure, how to a lot of cities, not so much New York, but oh man, as I toured around, you noticed really that a lot of cities have been completely decimated by kind of bowing down to the automobile. They have freeways that cut through the cities, cut through neighborhoods, destroy any sense of community. You can't get from one place to another except in a car. People become more isolated. It has all these knock-on effects. And now in the last, decade or two, we're starting to come out of that. And cities are starting to realize, no, if we want to have a city be a place where people can live, be together, and feel a sense of togetherness, and if a city benefits by kind of rubbing shoulders with one another and not just being locked up in a tin can. And so that's what cities are about, kind of unexpected collisions and not crashes, but unexpected meetings. Okay. And I realized that there's a lot of the infrastructure does not facilitate that kind of life, and especially in this country. But little by little, that's changing, little by little. And I thought, okay, I just have, I have to be a person who goes out, and I still find it in many cases the easiest and fastest and most enjoyable way to get from place to place.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen you many times. You kind of wear a gray suit a lot. And I've seen you riding with the helmet and the gray suit. And you're like, that's David. And it's. I think you even have folding bikes that you bring with you. Is that a thing?
The band and I all had folding bikes that we took on tour, so we get to various cities and we could go explore, and it's great for your sanity on tour. Yeah.
It's interesting because the way bicycling is, I used to race bicycles, and I was sponsored by Bianchi for a while. And, but the urban sense, when I moved to New York, I got rid of my bike because I just, like you're saying, it was like, oh man, this is hell. But you've been an advocate for that, both with urban planning, and I think even the New York City, like bicycle lane policies, there was a series of conversations I think you had with the city and the mayor and back then. Am I remembering that wrong?
I was close with Jeanette Sadik Khan, who was the transportation commissioner back in the Bloomberg days. And she put in a lot of the bike lanes and a lot of the little plazas that kind of sprung up here and there. Mm-hmm. Some of which people made fun of when she first did it. But it'd be, like some paint and a couple of potted plants and then some rickety chairs. But little by little, those became places where people congregated. Right. Yeah.
Well, what's amazing, though, is like a conversation between an artist and a creative and an urban design planning situation, and then someone who's an advocate for, that leads to better urban quality of living, more sustainable practices for design overall. And, one could argue that the car is really awful for urban infrastructure anyway. So, I mean, these are all things that I think. So whenever in the audience, whenever you now walk through New York and you see these wonderful kind of, places where artists have intervened, whether it be the High Line with Diller Scofidio, working with David Bowie, or, for that matter, David, you were also, I think, involved with some of that and the conversations around the High Line. There was an artist group, ranging from, again, David Bowie, you, others who intervened and had conversations with, I think, very robust levels of engagement with the government. It's refreshing because not a lot of times, one could argue Bloomberg, the Hudson River Yards, for example, the Hudson Yards, where the shed is, those are places where those were devastated, like train depots or something. But when artists come along and help change that dynamic, one could argue it's an urban renewal, which to me, I've always remembered that you were involved with the woman who did the planning. So I know it's 1:45, and I also want to be respectful of everybody's time. David, are you open to take some questions from the audience a little bit? Or...
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, you're good for time. Okay. And Chloe and Brooklyn Rail crew, how's everybody doing? Do you want to just jump in for a second?
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation, David and Paul. It's been really, really enlightening and great to hear about all of your current projects, David. We do have a few audience questions, so I will start with our friend GE. GE, feel free to ask your question first.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Chloe. And thank you, David, for all the years of joy and everything. My question is, in everything you've done, writing, producing, performing, and putting out the news web magazine, obviously, Reasons to Be Cheerful, you seem to be about radiating joy and hope. And the interesting to me is that it seemed as though you've struck upon ways to convey the joy and the hope without telling about us or telling us about it, but actually just, without saying, be hopeful, be joyful, but then just coming across and just giving it to us. And how did you come upon that very potent, kind of delivery system?
Probably like a lot of people, I don't like being told what to think, how to receive something. But it's also a very kind of theatrical adage, show, don't tell. Like if you're trying to convince an audience of something, you have to show them to it. They need to see it for their own eyes rather than just being told, oh, this is what's good, this is da 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 da, and then it's just like, wow, seeing it with your own eyes is a lot more convincing than being told about it.
And David, just to jump in for just a second, GE, thank you for that question.
Sure.
I mean, I'm glad you riffed on that because David, you're right. I mean, your music is relentlessly optimistic and also energizing in a way that, if you look at a lot of other music that came out of the 70s and 80s, one could argue, I grew up on Bad Brains, Minor Threat, which was a little bit DC thrash punk. But the other legacies of your music is this optimistic sensibility that, these are very cynical times. I mean, do you have, and I just want to leave that hanging in the air there because optimism versus cynicism are just strategies for critical thinking, one could argue. And I'd love to hear, I mean, the obvious, I want to leave people open for questions, but maybe one last little question for me is, what puts you in a good mood? Because your music is always, it's not cynical. It's really an optimistic sensibility.
Music puts me in a good mood. Hanging out with friends, that puts me in a good mood most of the time. Let's see. Yeah. Dancing, that puts me in a good mood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of negativity out there, and there's more than enough in the news and on the streets for us to feel pretty shitty about things. But the question then becomes, okay, so what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to complain, or are you going to do something about it? So I thought, okay, I have to take up that challenge a little bit. Not like I have all the solutions, but I sometimes have to get out the word that people are working on solutions. They're not all coming from me, but there are people who are doing things.
Yeah, reasons to be cheerful.
Mhm.
Okay, so that was my last question. Everybody else, you guys go for your questions. But I've always wanted to ask David, because it's just, anyway.
Yeah, thank you for
Chloe?
that. Yeah, thank you for that amazing question and additional question, Paul. The next question is going to be from Paul Gladstone. Paul, I'll give you the chance to unmute and ask directly. Thank you.
Is he there?
Hi. Thanks, Paul and David. David, you mentioned a relationship between your work and traditional Japanese theatre, and I'd always thought that Stop Making Sense had a resonance with kabuki, the kind of visible mechanics and the flat lighting. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that relationship, maybe a wider relationship with East Asian culture, and how deep that goes with your work.
I was on, yes. I'd been on a music tour with Talking Heads, and I stayed around Japan, and I was fascinated by kind of the traditional theatrical forms. And to me, they seem to be closer to kind of the pop music than they did to Western theatrical forms. Western theatrical forms are very kind of naturalistic. The people, at least in those days, a lot of times tried to recreate, say, a living room or on stage, and then they tried to act like you were invisibly spying on them in their living room. They didn't really acknowledge that they were performing on a stage. But whereas in Eastern theater, it's apparent that they're always performing on stage. They're performing, sometimes they might be talking to one another, but sometimes they're looking at the audience when they're talking to one another. There's no sense of naturalism. And as you said, yes, the lighting and the other things are very transparent. Paul, I think you mentioned Brecht the other day, and there's an aspect of that as well, where all the mechanics are made visible. You see that the costume changes happen right on stage. The lighting is what it is. It's not meant to it's not meant to do anything beyond what you can see. You can see how it's done. There's no attempt to trick you. So I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I think this has connections to what can be done in a pop music concert, maybe more than it can in conventional theater.
And any connections with Chinese culture and aesthetics? Obviously, you did the work on the soundtrack for The Last Emperor. I mean, did you get involved with relationships between your work and Chinese aesthetics when you did that and afterwards?
I was aware of Chinese opera, but not that much. I felt more of a connection with the Japanese theater and Balinese kind of performances and rituals and that kind of thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions, Paul, and for those answers, David. The next question is going to be from Ellen in the audience. Ellen, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you, Paul and David and Brook and Rail for this event. I have like a two-part question. One is there any, for David, is there any ritual that you perform, say, daily, whether it's exercise or a meditation or a special diet that kind of makes you sort of stay in the I am or the David or whatever you want to call that part? That's one question. And the other one is, there's a difference between the sort of largeness of these settings, and you're commenting on how big it is to move them from one place to another. Whereas in the past, your performances were about, let's take these costumes like they're settings almost, throw them in the back of the trunk and let's go, kind of thing, because it seemed like you did a lot of that. And I think somewhere I remember you commenting something about that when I saw an interview. And I just wanted to know if you wanted to comment about that, what that's like, from throwing like costume changes in the back of the trunk to having this whole entourage of having to move everything, and it's, a challenging thing, I would imagine.
Yeah. Okay. My daily rituals, I try and get a little exercise in every day. I don't always succeed, but I try. Of course, I get if I have some errands to run or meetings, I'm on a bicycle, so I've got a little bit there. And one of my favorite things is to sit in bed reading the paper and have coffee and a grapefruit in the morning. It's like that is a true habit that has been hard for me to break, to the extent where I'll bring a grapefruit. If I'm on traveling, I'll bring a grapefruit so I can sit in the hotel bed and do that. You were asking about what was the other part? Whoops, you're muted, I think.
Okay. Did you also, I just wanted along with that question, that first one, did you meditate at all? Or
Oh,
do you?
no, I tried meditating and I couldn't quite figure it out. I kept thinking about, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right?
Okay. The second part of that question was about moving things from one place to another, say the largeness of it, comparisons.
Yeah.
Costume changes in the past in the trunk of the car, that, if you want to comment on that. The difference.
Yeah. Certainly the scale of like the Theater of the Mind or Here Lies Love, there's a lot of sets and a lot of technology and everything behind it, more than I could have ever imagined back in the day. But yeah, there's occasionally times when I'll do something kind of more stripped down. But yeah, some of these things now do require some technology, which I'm very lucky to have found myself in a place where I can actually indulge in some of that.
Thank you so much for those questions, Ellen, and thank you for those answers, David. Your answer about technology is a perfect pivot to our next question from Tom Shriver. Tom, I'm going to give you the chance to unmute and ask directly.
Oh, great. Thanks, Chloe. Hi, Paul. Hi, David. Great to see everybody. I'm thinking about where we are with generative AI and opening up new forms of collaboration with between people and machines. And I tacked on another piece of that. Certainly, Bob Rauschenberg comes to mind and experiments in art and technology. Where do you think that discussion goes as connecting across all those different ideas and expanding technology, putting it to the service of creativity for artists?
Paul, do you want to take this one?
Well, maybe we'll have a clone of David Byrne thing, a hologram on the moon. I remember one of my favorite recent movies is Denis Villeneuve's remake of Blade Runner, where the characters run to Las Vegas and there's a glitching Elvis hologram in the middle of the movie. It's kind of like it's arguing about the wind at this point, because it's definitely we're in a data-driven society. Musicians, artists, creatives are always going to engage with the mediums that it's just a new palette. And again, David, I remember your collaborations with Rauschenberg and your collaborations with Ryuichi Sakamoto and with David Byrne. I'm sorry, with Brian Eno. These are all kind of pivotal points where music and technology, video, multimedia, these are they've always been very inspiring and very dynamic. The intriguing thing that I think the question brings to light is that the idea of large scale data sets. Most of the stuff, Chat GPT and so on, are just they're combing through the web and building massive data sets for which artists are not being compensated. That is tricky. And then the Supreme Court, David, this probably is of interest to you. The Supreme Court recently ruled that Andy Warhol, he had appropriated some photographs of Prince, and then he did these portraits of Prince, and the Andy Warhol estate then preemptively sued the photographer because the photographer was about to sue them, saying who owns the image, the painting. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Andy Warhol's estate lost. So, it's going to be tricky because all these issues around your archive, large scale modeling systems that can take anybody's voice, anybody's image, anybody's sound, and just do a predictive algorithm on it. I mean, David, in a way, you're from a different generation, because I think originality and being able to synthesize these things by practicing as a band or practicing as a physical artist for me at least, it's a vernacular issue. I use AI generative stuff all the time now. It's been super helpful. And it, I'm agnostic because I don't really feel that it's a crisis. It actually just feels like it's just another tool. It saves me a lot of time editing video, it saves me a lot of time doing rough drafts of songs, stuff like that. But generations wise, there's always going to be controversies whenever new tools come into play. I mean, people used to argue about Betamax versus VHS. But David, how do you? I mean, for opera purposes, though, would you use characters that have been synthesized, or have you thought about any of these kinds of more generative materials for theater? Because that's going to be a thing, I'm sure, in the near future.
I'm sure it will be. No, I haven't thought about it much. In general, when some technology comes along, I find that one has to some extent resist being sucked into it, because it always has an agenda. There's always with any technology, it wants you to do things in a certain way. It wants to organize things and name things and look at things in a certain way. And that might not be what you want to do, but it's kind of pulling you in that direction. So I feel like you have to constantly be alert to what is it really that you want to say? What kind of groove do you want in this song? And it might not be the groove that the machine wants. You might want to stretch it a little bit here and there and do different things, which granted, the technologies can be really, really helpful doing some of those things, but I think it's always important to be asking ourselves, what is it that we want to do?
Mm-hmm. And thank you for the question. And David, also thank you for that response. Chloe, do you have anybody? I love the fact that David is such a you're kind of like shamanic figures. I'm really enjoying hearing all the questions. And Bob Holman's in the audience. Bob, I think you guys probably know each other from. God, he was married to Elizabeth Murray, the painter, really wonderful painter. And he has Bowery Poetry Club, which I always enjoy that spot. It's across from the old CBGBs.
Thank you both so much for those answers. And thank you, Tom, for that really generative and great question. The next question is from Mark in the audience. Mark, I'm going to give you the chance to unmute and ask directly if you'd like.
Hi, how are you? Paul, it's great to see your face. We're friends here. I live in Denver, so I think I'm still good morning to both of you, or noon right now. David, I really appreciate all the work that you do in Denver. It's great. I've been able to see many of the things you do. As you know, the immersive scene here in Denver is exploding. We have the work that you did. We have Meow Wolf open here. The new Casa Bonita is opening up that everybody's heard about, which is very much an old immersive experience. I work in the immersive arts here. I'm involved with the collective Itch.io, who you're familiar with. I'm the special effects designer for all of our stage productions. And I'd like to get your feedback about what you feel the future of immersive art holds. I've been involved in immersive art before we called it immersive art. We had other names for it before then. And I'd just like to know what your take is on where we're going with the immersive industry.
Paul, I don't know if you're familiar with Itch.io. There's this kind of collective out of Denver. They're not that well known here in New York, I would say. But in the kind of Colorado or all that whole area, they're kind of known for these performances that really engage the audience. The audience goes to a show knowing that it's going to be, they're not just going to sit and watch a band perform on stage. There's going to be a whole thing is going to, they're going to be engaged and involved. It's pretty exciting. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if there's any way to capture it besides actually being there.
I know Mark. Yeah. Mark, the Colorado scene, there's this, they really have these crazy drumming sessions, and it's like full on theater. And I know Mark from Boulder, Colorado. So that was refreshing. Thanks, Mark, for joining the conversation. Hey, Chloe, do you guys want to, or Mark, are you have any follow-up questions, or are we good to go there, or?
I'm gonna give, we've got a few more questions, David, for you, if that's all right.
Okay.
We have a question from Helena in the audience. That's a great question. Helena, if you'd like to, you are welcome to unmute here. Let me give you the chance to do so.
Hi there. I just want to say thank you so much. This has been such an incredible conversation, and I'm such fans of both of you. But my question was related to the incredible projects you've done with Latinx and Latin American performers over the years and through Luakabop. And I would just love to hear if you have any projects of that nature coming up.
No, I'm in touch with some Latin music artists, maybe doing some collaborations with them, but kind of in the early stages. There's nothing big coming up that way. But I will say that a lot of the Latin music performers are now kind of ubiquitous all over. It's kind of amazing. The people who are dominating, say, the streaming charts, whether it's Apple or Spotify or whatever, are often Latin artists. And which it would have been hard to imagine that, 30 years ago or whatever. It's a huge, huge change. I think it's really positive.
Okay, we've got two more questions, David. Helena, thank you so much for that question. And thank you, David, for your answer. The second to last question is going to be from Tyhe Cooper. Tyhe, feel free to ask directly.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, David and Paul, for such an awesome conversation today. I was wondering, David, if you could talk, obviously this is kind of an obvious question from me because I'm reading to close today, but I wanted to hear more about your literary influences, because I think in all of your work that the literary influence on a whole is really present. And I was thinking about your Pace show and feeling like there was, those works are sort of poem drawings. In a way, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I heard a little rumor that you maybe liked the New York School, so.
Yeah, one of my favorite poetry books is one called Bean Spasms, which you might be familiar with. Yes. Yes, and my literary interests. I find that there's a lot of really interesting, I don't know what you call it, surreal or fantastic or whatever, imaginary writing now that I'm really interested in. There's the writer Ted Chiang, who's mainly does short stories that have to do with kind of imagining the future in some ways, some things like that. Sometimes the distant past. Had a great story about the Tower of Babel. That was really an incredible story. An Argentine writer, Samantha Schweiben, I think is her name. She did a book of short stories called A Mouthful of Birds. I really liked that. There's another writer from Chile, Benjamin something or other. He did a book about science, but it veered from fiction to nonfiction. It was about, and you couldn't quite tell. Did he make that part up or did he make that part up? Sometimes it was kind of clear, if he gets into how someone was feeling or whatever at a particular moment. I thought he wasn't there. Nobody's written about that. But the foundation of it was all factual. It was a really slightly disturbing kind of writing that it raised a lot of issues.
A
Thank
good blurb. They should take that. Slightly disturbing, raises a lot of issues.
Mhm.
Thank you for that question, Ty, and thank you for those answers, David. The final question for today will be from our publisher and artistic director at the Rail, Fong Bui.
Thank you, Chloe. David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Paul. Yeah, the last time we saw each other in person was so long ago. You came to Jonas Maker's show at my
Oh, yeah.
show. That was 2006. Would you believe it, David?
Wow, that was a while ago. Yeah.
I know. And I just yesterday, actually, afternoon, I have a chance to look at this wonderful film documentary on Jonas. It's called Fragments on Paradise, in which I appear in it also a little bit with our friend Jim Jarmusch. And Jim was referring Jonas as a master kung fu master, like a real high form of a master. I don't know. I was thinking about that in context because, when I came to Philadelphia from Vietnam, I went to Talking Head concert at Mann Music Center, 1983. So I saw you after that, but that was a big deal. So going back to what Jim was talking about, Jonas, very few people, I think, in our creative community can move so fluidly from one medium to the next. And just don't think about it. It's sort of what, in Song of Solomon, when Toni Morrison say, if you surrender to the wind, you can ride it. And I felt that's what you've been able to do, for all of these years. And it's interesting when you mentioned the poem, Beans Pasm. It's actually written by our poetry editor's father.
Oh my goodness.
Yep, I know that poem super well. It was written for our late friend, George Schneeman, another great poet. But thinking about it, I saw Tight Spot, that cold air inflated balloon with audio, sound.
Yes.
That was, and I without knowing it was you, I suspected it was you. And I tell you why. There is a consistent in oddity in movement in regard to scale and rhythm. And I think that wherever you made music, opera, everything you've done, there's always that oddity of scale and rhythm. Can you comment on that just a little? I know you don't need to think about it. That's exactly why you surrender to the wind. Still, occasionally you had to pause a little bit to figure out what that meant. Am I right about this, David?
Yeah, I think occasionally I have to pause. Occasionally I have to say, I have to realize, no, I can recharge my batteries regarding kind of writing songs or something. But to do that, I have to go outside of that area. I have to go look at theater or read some books or, do something else. And that will kind of give me some insights that then I can bring back and use. It's kind of extraordinary. I mean, occasionally when I jump into an area that I'm kind of not known for, occasionally I get some resistance. Hey, stay in your lane, stay in your lane. But really, I've been very, very lucky that way.
Yeah.
As far as people giving me a chance to do things outside of what I initially started doing, which is kind of rare. And I think it says something to people's generosity that they'll accept that. And I think that's really encouraging if they could do that to more people and allow more people to do that.
Okay, well, that's terrific. It's good to know that you do have some resistance to some new idea.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is not related at all, but I've been trying to figure out whether, because Bertolucci, Led Emperor, your soundtrack is it's amazing, which won all kind of Academy and Grammy and Golden Globe Best Original Score and whatnot. But it's reminded me so much of Roy Cooder soundtrack for Paris, Texas. And I think Roy Cooder is one of those remarkable, not just a great guitar player, we know he play with anybody, but the appetite for his musical repertoire is so wide. I mean, I don't know, that he started out playing with Captain Beefheart.
Oh, no, I didn't know that. That makes a lot of sense. That
Doesn't
makes a lot
it?
of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I wonder whether you guys have met. I don't know.
We met a long time ago. We were introduced by some friends. But yeah, I never really stayed in touch with him. But he also did some really nice collaborations with the Cuban musicians and African musicians. He's very adept at with some musicians from Okinawa. He did a great record with some Okinawan musicians. And his interventions are really subtle.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly what my question was. The Buena Vista Social Club, when it was actually playing at the Carnegie Hall, 98. I went to it. Was amazing. Well, David, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on to our NSE, and can't wait to see you in person. Thank you, Paul, for this amazing conversation. And yeah, back to you, Chloe.
Wait, hang tight, but just one second. David, I just want to say we are all mega fans of what you've been up to, and I just want to say, just from a very heartfelt thank you for making the time. And I know you're crazy busy, and you have the new opera opening. So just a heartfelt thank you. And we're an independent group, and we really love to see amazing stuff happen. So Fong, it was a pleasure to see you and Dave interact, and Chloe, everybody. It's just incredible to see the evolution of the work over the years and the consistent, really high level thinking about what's going on. And I just want to tell the audience, if you haven't had a moment, please see the opera. It's a really just life affirming and intriguing take on both politics, revolution, and opera. So yeah, David, thanks again.
Thank you very much. Yes, it was nice to do. And
Thank you.
Congratulations on Brooklyn Rail. Yeah.
Thank you all so much as well from the Rail as well. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome our poet laureate of the day and my colleague at the Rail, Tyhe Cooper. Tyhe Cooper is a writer working in experimental prose, poetry, and digitality. They are the production editor and poetry events curator at the Rail. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tyhe for a reading.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And thank you again, David and Paul, for this really, really great conversation. I think I maybe audibly exclaimed when you said that Bean Spasms was a favorite, but those are all of my very favorite people in the world, living or dead. So that's a really lovely connect. I am having this feeling that a poem just doesn't feel big enough, but it is what I do and have. So that's what's coming. I'm going to read two poems today. The first is brand new, so it doesn't have a title, but it's about water. I'm not rewriting anything, just adding data, net positive. There is a frog croaking in the reservoir. I'm no nature poet. My toes are cold. The cut on my knuckle is purple. I scraped it, popping sparkling wine in Ridgewood with sticky fingers. I called it the mark of the devil. Frog again. Whatever that feeling is came again today. We lifted each other's shirts to press our stomachs together, sliced open and wanting. The birds are everywhere, and the wind is on the water, in the trees, and I am here, nowhere else. The day is water. I am water. The tree is water. The frog is hiding. The frog is water. Somewhere, Fifth Avenue is water. We drink water from a plastic jug. We shower. We are clean and smell like eggs and shea butter. We sleep. We fuck. Fucking is water. Water is hard and cold and slick and hot. I'm trying to remember the last time I had an original thought. At the supermarket, the pineapples are missing their horns, like rhinos neutered safe from poachers. Noah picks flowers off the side of the road, the same ones I got punctured into my thigh when I was 18, only 5 years ago, laying half naked in Williamsburg with my homework in my hand and a needle in my hip. I don't know if I'll ever sleep right on another pillow. I covet, I keep, I give. The song circles back on itself, the sound of keys, the fridge. I eat these carrots. I run out of breath. And then this next one is about my friend Sisyphus. If Sisyphus swallowed the boulder, he would just be walking up a hill. Sisyphus has his hands in his mouth, and I'm in the press box, learning how to yell from my diaphragm. He's got 4 fingers on each hand shoved inside his mouth, and I think he just might do it. They're wrenched in there like the inverse of a man miming a ring box, a clam in reverse. The boulder is resting on his chest, his hips jutted out to keep it still while he pulls, his back arched girlishly. Sisyphus is posturing himself for utility, and I'm at Rockaway Surf Club, sitting up straight when the butch lesbian sits down next to me while salsa drips down the curved edges of my forearm. He inches his fingers along the ridge of his tooth line all the way to the right and hooks his pinkies away from each other into flesh. His eyes are wincing shut. There's something happening in his knees that he can't quite see. His elbows are certain, and there's a pop. His jaw has gone slack and is jutting counterintuitively to the left, but not for long. His fingers are sliding back over. He's determined. He's done it before. His left, our right, 2 hands, and a break. Sisyphus is screaming in pain and triumph, and I'm chasing my sense of urgency down the Williamsburg bike highway. The jaw is out of the way. A breath. He rests his forehead on the cool dampness of the boulder. Never enough sunlight to dry it out. What does he know about rocks? Sisyphus is resting, and I'm swallowing iron vitamins from a Ziploc bag in the middle of the school hallway, while 7th grade Sean Simonetti tells me he loves me over the sounds of lockers closing and being late to cheer practice. Throat next. His arms are bumping up against each other as he slides them through this brand new passageway. He vomits to lubricate the tube. His elbows are touching, wrists crossing over each other. Elementary schoolers everywhere know this construction well, twisting their arms up into each other to trick their brains out of knowing which finger is which, but this knot is on the inside. With his arms buried as deep as they'll go, his hip bones chafing 9-year-old playground knees red against the boulder, he starts to pull himself apart. Sisyphus is bleeding from his hip bones, and I'm no longer vomiting, 9 years old, falling through the middle of a tire swing. I'm flat on my back in dried out mulch, looking up at clouds and New Balance sneakers with charmed shoelaces, flailing. His arms come out hot and slick, coated and covered variously, mixing into a bodily reddish brown. Pushing his hair behind his ears, he holds the rock in place with his elbows, and heel shove lifts his shoes off one at a time. He's shoving the toes of his sneakers under the edge of the boulder like doorstops, hoisting himself up while his socks slide down his heels. Sisyphus is taking off his socks with 6 slick thumbs, and my size 4 sorrel boot is stuck in the snowbank. I'm crying to the childless neighbors about maple syrup and the custody battle that hasn't happened yet. His sticky, hot arms go back inside and pull. Sisyphus is enacting a dream at great personal risk. And I'm wearing all my t-shirts inside out so that the message is only for me, and I can feel it pushing against my skin, sticking to me with sweat. I'm announcing everything to myself by letting it seep into me. And pull, and he's shoving jaw over rock, but he's never been good at handstands. Sisyphus is contracting his abdominal muscles, and I'm 9, 13, 22, counting every stair and memorizing the sets in case of fire. He's trying to get momentum, but his feet are in the sky, and his jaw is on the rock, and he's not moving. Sisyphus is split beyond consciousness, and I'm talking to my therapist about my 5-year plan. I'm looking away from my split screen and holding my own hands to talk about a motorcycle and the things that people have been asking of me. She's showing me a video of a whale on her phone, and Sisyphus has his legs in the air, stone dead with his toes out. That's it. Thank you so much.
Yes, Ty, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank
you all. I'm going to head out. Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you, David. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ty. Thank you as well to Kate, Katie, and Dana from Grandstand Media and Salwa from Todo Mundo for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with this month's guest critics section contributors on the topic of New Worlds, hosted by the Rail's June guest critic, Allison Glenn. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us for this today. And until we see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Reading time.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Fabulous.
David and Natasha.
Everyone for the question.
Wonderful
Great rest of your day.
reading. Thank you,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Great
everybody.
reading, Ty.
Bye now.